This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
And all of a sudden, the inflammation goes down, and many of those people were pregnant shortly thereafter.
They knew that fertility was a sign of health. We seem to have forgotten that.
We talk about how important our lifestyle choices are today.
We now know that the microbiome of the father is evident in newborns.
It's really important for every one of your listeners to know that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female health.
That you and I, looking at each other right now, recognize that by and large, it's a preventable situation.
And the answer is so important that it can define not just whether you're healthy or sick, but whether you're a different species.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the health journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 1 of The Shift, we explore the fascinating field of gut health and help you discover what is really going on with your digestion, microbiome, and health.
The gut is amazing.
Changes our concept of the human body become useless to the healthcare system.
We're always shifting. Your genes are shifting, your microbes are shifting, everything is shifting.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. So what do you think so far? Are human beings on the way out? Is the demise of our species imminent? In part 1, we introduced the concept of chronic disease or non-communicable disease becoming increasingly prevalent. And we looked at some facts that were frankly scary about where we're headed if we don't make a shift. In part 2, we're going to continue this conversation, moving into some other areas of health that are rapidly worsening. The more research I read on the microbiome, the more fascinated I became. Here we have Rodney Dieterdt again, talking about our microbiome in relation to our ability to procreate.
I was always taught that species exists. If you think about species, what makes a difference between humans and other species, among plant species, among insects, what are the differences between species where they can't mate and produce viable offspring? You know, they're either the fertilized egg doesn't develop, or they're killed and they die before birth, or things like that. You know, so they're incompatible. Well, what's interesting is I was always taught those are based on chromosomal gene differences, where you can't produce a hybrid, and so you have a species barrier, a hybrid that's viable, that grows up and itself reproduces. It'll be sterile, you know, like the horse, mule, donkey situation. So it turns out that's not true. That's not the only way it happens. So researchers at Vanderbilt and in Europe, working on different systems, have shown that you can have species barriers that are created between the immune system, which is host genes. I mean, that's in part your host chromosomal genes and your conditioning by the microbiome. The host immune system interacting with the microbiome, that you can have matings where the immune system says, no, I'm killing myself. And it does. And that's happened in parasitic wasps. There are 4 different species. It happens in a subspecies of house mouse in Europe, where they're geographically separated, kind of Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. And if you bring them together and mate them, the immune system doesn't like the microbiome. What's it do? It does the same thing it does when we have non-communicable diseases. It produces massive inflammatory responses that damage tissues, and in the end will kill. So you can have a species barrier, in this case, that you can eliminate. And the way you eliminate it is massively treat the animal with antibiotics so the immune system doesn't see the microbiome in the hybrid, and they can mate, and they're viable. They're not healthy because they don't have a microbiome, but no longer do you have species differences. Who would have thought? Because the implication is, how important is the immune microbiome interaction? And the answer is so important that it can define not just whether you're healthy or sick, but whether you're a different species.
So people are going to hear this and their brains are just going to go,
Yeah.
it's huge, huge. And the implications for that, if we didn't know that, what else don't we know?
Exactly.
Is the interesting
Exactly.
question. How much of a role do you think this kind of thing has in infertility then for humans?
It certainly does, because again, there's your genital tract microbiome. And so that can be really important. We know, again, that, for example, miscarriage, recurrent miscarriage can be an immunological balance problem. It can be treated with drugs, by the way, but essentially it's because, even the chromosomal encoded antigens in the fetus, some of those are from the father. And the mother hasn't seen them, the mother thinks they're foreign, the mother would attack them if not otherwise suppressed. And that's actually the explanation as to why the baby grows up kind of in an immune skewed way, because those reactions aren't permitted to exist as well in the mother or to be developing in the baby either. Kind of have what's called a Th2 biased environment, and Th2 being a form of the immune responses, but not the whole spectrum. So we know that immune status is really important, and the immune microbiome interaction is going to be important as well. And there are even some studies that suggest the microbiome will affect your food preferences, and in animal studies, it can affect your mating preferences as well. Now, we thought some of that was due to immune response genes, and maybe it is, but maybe the immune system is seeking out compatible microbiome.
This conversation with Rodney really got me thinking. I mean, it changes our whole concept of the human body if our microbiome is possibly more important than our human genes when it comes to reproduction. Infertility is on the rise too, with 1 in 6 couples in Australia having difficulty and 1 in 8 Americans. There are many reasons for this, but one thing that we know to be true is that male sperm count is on the decline. In one 2017 study, it was found that sperm counts per millimetre of semen had declined by more than 50% between 1973 and 2011. And when they looked at total sperm counts, they were down by almost 60%. This means that we're producing less semen, but also less sperm as well. Other causes for infertility are again environmental toxins, but we also spoke about the microbiome being linked to women's health issues like polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS and endometriosis, 2 known factors that can contribute to infertility. I was curious about the role of the microbiome and our gut health in infertility, so I asked gynecologist Dr. Felice Gersh about it.
Well, it is very significant, like all the microbiomes are. But if we look at the gut microbiome, we know that there's a huge communication between the gut microbiome, the brain, and even the ovary. So there is a relationship to everything. The ovary, actually, when you have a dysbiotic gut microbiome and you have a lot of inflammation, so when you have the wrong bacteria growing in the gut and you have impaired gut barrier function, because if you don't have the right microbes in the gut, then the microbes work in conjunction, the right ones, work in conjunction with specialized cells that are in our lining of our gut, called goblet cells, that make mucus. So together they create this really amazing protective mucus coating that keeps toxins, we call them endotoxins or lipopolysaccharides, that are these toxic components of bad bacteria, from crossing the line, through the spaces between the lining cells of the gut and into our body proper, where there's a lot of immune cells that are ready and poised to release inflammation at the first sign of an invader. That's their role. But when you have a constant bombardment of toxins, they're going to release inflammation on a continual basis. When you have chronic inflammation that's released by these inflammatory cells, it communicates with the brain. We know there's the gut-brain axis, and you can call it the gut-brain immune axis, because the immune cells are really the interface between the gut and the brain. And along with the vagus nerve and the short-chain fatty acids that are the metabolites of fermentation. It's a whole amazing and complex, perfect system when things are right. And when you have things wrong and you have a dysbiotic gut and then the brain is impacted, then that can change the signaling. After all, the brain is in charge of the ovaries, in charge of everything. And the rhythms are all guided by our hormones and so on. But when you have inflammation, it changes everything. It changes like our cortisol production, which everyone knows that's, well, not everyone, but it's like that along with melatonin is extremely circadian, right? And inflammation can change that whole thing. That's how stress can also change it. So inflammation, stress, they can all have similar effects and can block ovulation. That's why women who are stressed, whether it's emotional or a bad gut, and they have inflammation circulating their body, creating neuroinflammation, it affects the sections of the brain, like the hypothalamus, to put out the proper signals to keep the ovaries working properly, to keep this incredible process of ovulation and fertilization going. So when you have an abnormal gut microbial population, yes, it can change your cycles. And of course, it not only changes your cycles that they can become irregular and that you're not ovulating, you can also get terrible periods where they're extra heavy, where there's more pain and cramping, because the ovaries actually also become inflamed. The inflammation that's created from the gut dysbiosis circulates, and you have generalized inflammation, and it can cause inflammation in the ovaries, which can then, of course, not only alter the act of ovulation, but ends up changing everything, and you get inflammation that goes out of control in the uterus. So every time a woman has a period, she makes these little inflammatory products called prostaglandins, and they have a natural role because a menstrual period is an inflammatory state naturally, because you're putting out all this necrosis and dying tissue from inside the lining, and the uterus naturally will have some contractions or cramping, but it should be mild, and that helps the uterine lining products to come out because your body has to get rid of it. And a little bit of cramping, just a little bit, can help push it out. But all of these systems are out of control. So you have the wrong microbiomes, you're getting the wrong signals, and then you're producing too much of this prostaglandin, and you get too much inflammation in the uterus. So you get really bad cramps and heavy periods. And of course, then that leads to the girls being put immediately on birth control pills, which is not fixing it. Because it's really important for every one of your listeners to know that the menstrual cycle is a vital sign of female health. When the menstrual cycle is abnormal, whether it's very heavy periods, irregular cycles, really bad cramps, that is a red flag that the young woman who has those terrible periods has problems. She may have nutrient deficiencies, like magnesium is a very key one. She may have systemic inflammation, gut dysbiosis, vaginal abnormalities with the microbiome. The solution is to find the problem and fix it, not to whitewash it, by trying to cover it up with birth control pills, because you're just kicking the can down the road. The day of reckoning will come. And then this young girl down the road is going to have terrible bones, more gut problems, irritable bowel syndrome, high rates, significantly increased rates of autoimmune disease, depression, anxiety, insomnia. I mean, just really bad stuff is in her future. And we are just not paying attention to this. So when a woman has a bad menstrual cycle, whatever that problem is, we need to try to fix her. The menstrual cycle is really a tremendous clue as to the general health of that woman. That's why ancient civilizations worshipped fertility gods. How come they were so much smarter than us? They knew that fertility was a sign of health. We seem to have forgotten that.
Next up, we're going to release the Expert Series, featuring more in-depth conversations with our 24 experts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a thing.
The Shift!
As you can see, there is a lot going on in the background to keep our reproductive systems healthy. There's lots of pieces to this, but gut health absolutely has a role to play. I knew that Dr. Tom O'Brien had a story around infertility, so I asked him to share it with me.
1979, I was an intern. My wife and I could not get pregnant. I called the 7 most famous holistic doctors I'd ever heard of. And I said, hi, I'm just an intern, but I'm wondering, we can't get pregnant. What do you do? And they would say, well, do you know what a category 1 is? No. Learn. Okay. And I'd write down category 1. And they'd write down about folic acid and all these things. I put a program together. We were pregnant in 6 weeks. My neighbors in married housing, we lived on campus at the time, they had gone through artificial insemination and nothing had worked. They asked if I'd work with them. And I said, well, I don't really know that it's going to hurt you. Okay, sure, okay. They were pregnant in 3 months. So before I got out and practiced, I was hot to trot to help every couple get pregnant that was having problems getting pregnant. I was treating people out of our dorm room before I was in the clinic because we were really happy to be pregnant, and our friends would tell their sister in Wisconsin that this young doctor, they got pregnant, and they just all of a sudden, and she would fly down from Wisconsin and come to my dorm room, and I would work with them. And so we've helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, couples over the years get pregnant, whether it's recurrent miscarriages or infertility. And there's not much in medicine that's all or every, but this is an every. Clinically speaking, this was an every. Every couple that wanted to get pregnant, every couple were eating foods that were causing inflammation in their body, and they didn't know it. They didn't know it. Take those foods out of the diet, that's the first step. And the most common was wheat. Take those foods out of the diet, and all of a sudden the inflammation goes down, and many of those people were pregnant shortly thereafter, many of the couples. And we've all heard the story of a couple trying to get pregnant, they can't get pregnant, they can't get pregnant, they can't get pregnant. They go through artificial insemination, they do everything they can, it doesn't work. So finally they decide to adopt. And when they decide to adopt and they're in the adoption process, all of a sudden they get pregnant. So what does that tell you? Well, it's the emotional side of the pyramid that wasn't being addressed. Whatever that was, that had a major role to play for them. Here's an example, though, the role that the father plays in all this. We know that the microbiome of the newborn primarily is the microbiome of the mom. Depending on how the birth process was and were they then breastfed or did they get colostrum and all of that. But also, we now know that the microbiome of the father is evident in newborns. How does that happen? Well, because the couples, bacteria around the groin, the couples get close, they get intimate regularly, and it gets passed on into mom's vaginal tract. Then also about food sensitivities. Children of celiac mothers weigh 222 grams less than the national average. Children of celiac fathers, so the mothers are not celiac, children of celiac fathers weigh 266 grams less than the national average. So that just drops the jaw of people when you read that study and you go, what? How does that happen, right? So the offspring are the offspring of the male and the female, not just the female.
That's fascinating. And I didn't know that, and I haven't heard of that before. And if people aren't aware too, like a friend of mine, she's doing her PhD at the moment on stunting and small for birth weight babies. And I didn't realise so much before speaking to her that a small for birth weight baby indicates every other disease that they're going to get later in life. So they have higher risk of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, depression, schizophrenia, the lot.
I just completed a chapter for a new textbook on cardiovascular medicine. And the chapter is on wheat-related disorders and cardiovascular disease. And for newborn babies that weigh less than 5 pounds, I'm going to make up the number because I'm not sure. It's an 18% increased risk of developing cardiovascular disease early in life. Between 5 pounds and 6 pounds, it's 12%. Between 6 pounds and 7 pounds, it's 8%. But the lower the birth weight, not premature, but intrauterine growth retardation. The lower the birth weight, the higher the risk of cardiovascular disease. And I found 4 studies on that. So I would easily accept what your friend who studying in her PhD thesis, it's not just cardiovascular disease, it's brain disease and cancer and many other conditions. Failure to thrive is not height and weight. Failure to thrive is a failure to thrive. Your thyroid doesn't develop completely. Your adrenals don't. Your blood vessels don't. Your heart doesn't when you have a failure to thrive. You want to find the kids that are wheat-related, sensitive, and celiacs? Take a class of 30 kids, take the 5 shortest kids in the class and test them. Consistently, you'll find 80 to 90% of those kids, the shortest kids in the class, have wheat-related disorders. They've got elevated antibodies to wheat. Now, there's no study on that. That's just a clinical observation.
In the last episode, integrative neurologist Dr. David Perlmutter spoke about the massive links to diet and gut health in the development of Alzheimer's. For a lot of us, it's difficult to imagine being in our 60s and 70s and something like this happening to us. It can be hard for people to want to make changes now to prevent issues that are potentially decades away. I asked Dr. David why people need to pay attention to these things right now.
Again, I quote that literature and I ask them to read Grain Brain because we talk about it. We talk about how important our lifestyle choices are today. How important it is, for example, to keep your blood sugar really low in recognizing that average blood sugar is a powerful risk marker for developing shrinkage of your brain and cognitive decline. So I quote the literature so people can understand this is science. And I think that it's important that I set an example. I explain what my diet is like, what my meditation program is like, how I invest in restorative sleep, how important exercise is, that my fasting blood sugar is 68, that I reach a beta-hydroxybutyrate level, a ketone level of about 0.6 to 0.8 on a daily basis when I check. These are all kind of sophisticated ideas, but I tell them the reason I do it is twofold. A, because as you well mentioned, I've treated thousands of Alzheimer's patients. And with each one, family members asked me, Doc, now that I know mom or dad has this problem, what can I do to mitigate my risk? That's reason number one. And reason number two is I went through this with my father. I held his hand through the worst parts of this disease. And I know what people go through. I understand the emotional component of this. And I also understand that I'm at increased risk. So I think that my actions set an important example for two reasons. Number one, that it's not just here, do what I say, not what I do. But B, that we can reduce risk. We can do a lot to prevent this disease.
It's really scary, isn't it, from that point of view? But that's a good chunk of your life.
It is, and the heart-wrenching part of that story is that you and I, looking at each other right now, recognize that by and large, it's a preventable situation. And there are great forces at work keeping the population from knowing that.
What percentage of disease that's happening today do you think is preventable?
A lot, a large number. I'd say, of course, depending on the type of disease we're talking about. There are some diseases that are purely straightforward genetic issues that we do not have the technology to prevent. But Alzheimer's is not one of them. And diabetes and cancer, by and large, are not those diseases, nor is coronary artery disease. These are, by and large, diseases brought on by lifestyle. And as such, they are, by and large, preventable. Are there genes associated with Alzheimer's risk? Absolutely they are. They're not risk determinants, but they are predisposition genes. You are slightly or significantly increased risk by virtue of carrying, for example, the APOE4 allele. It doesn't mean it's in stone that you're going to get that disease.
What do you think the importance of looking at human genetics versus the microbiome is?
Well, recognize that the microbiome influences the expression of the human genome. So those are not disparate discussions. And at the same time, our human genome influences the functionality and diversity of our gut bacteria. That our human genome is changed moment to moment in its expression by our lifestyle choices. The code itself is indelible, but the keys on the piano remain static in terms of the number of keys. But how the song is played, how those keys express themselves, is something very much under your control. And that's a new way of thinking about this idea of epigenetics, that we influence the expression of our genetic code, that our gut bacteria also influence the expression of our genetic code. And therein lies our ability to override these predispositions for things like Alzheimer's or heart disease.
I love that analogy. I think that's excellent. So it's like we're moving out of the age of blaming our genes for our problems. Well, my mum had it, so it's sort of likely that I will as well. What's something that you're really passionate about right now?
I believe that what we're seeing globally is something called disconnection syndrome, which that's not a name you would have heard of yet, but you will. It means that we are disconnected at so many levels from being on our path. We're disconnected from the gift of our genome because we're changing our gene expression for the negative. We're disconnected from the life supportive signaling coming from our microbiome, the fact that our 100 trillion gut bacteria want to do everything they can to keep us healthy. We're disconnected from the area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex that allows us to be the people we really could be, compassionate, empathetic, planning for the future. We're disconnected from each other, from understanding the ideas of another individual. We're disconnected from our neighbors. We're disconnected from other countries, and we're disconnected from our planet. So what I'm passionate about moving forward at this stage in my life is the notion of giving people information about reconnecting through all of those examples that I just mentioned. Reconnecting to nature, reconnecting to the signals of our genome, reconnecting to our microbiomes, reconnecting, most importantly, to each other. Because the signals are not indicating that we're going in the right direction. And I think we absolutely can. And that's what I wake up in the morning thinking about, that we can do this.
I love David's analogy. It's like we're moving out of the age of blaming our genes for our health issues into a time when we can really take responsibility for our health. If we can find out what's affected us upstream and work to actively prevent disease from expressing itself, we can begin to turn around this increase in chronic disease and get back to health. But if we don't take action, where will we be? If we keep doing what we have been, who knows what the future of the human race looks like? Will we have to live in a bubble in fear of allergies? Will we be in pain or discomfort? Will we begin to get sicker even earlier as our environmental load increases? And could we potentially become infertile enough that it could compromise the existence of the human race? This is a lot to digest, I know. And to be honest, when researching this episode, I came across some stats that surprised even me. But I want you to be one of the ones that are breaking the mould. In the next episode, we're going to explore the food part of this equation and give you some great insights as to what you need to change in order to stay out of the NCD cohort.
Coming up on The Shift.
Most people would consider those healthy food snacks.
Non-celiac gluten sensitivity is very real.
We don't need to demonize a whole food group as we've done over the last 20, 30 years.
Cow milk protein is meant for a cow.
I hope you're loving the information in The Shift as much as I do. But maybe you're thinking, what do I need to do for me? Take our online assessment to discover what your gut is up to. Go to theshiftclinic.com/quiz.
The Shift!
This series is produced by Must Amplify. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Executive producer Ronsley Vaz. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com/gut.
Still listening? Do you have a question you'd like to see answered? Go to theshiftclinic.com/group, jump in the community and ask us.
The Shift! Thank you for listening.
every listen or download of this show.
And hence this voice
directly funds the ending of sex
and human trafficking.
A voice for a voice.
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 Amplify. Impact.com.